Greetings and welcome to Aspects of Aliyah. We're now going to look at the questions of Zionism and Aliyah. Of course, the two things walk hand in hand. Unfortunately, Zionism became a pejorative term, particularly in the post-war period, by the Russians and extreme left-wing politicians in other parts of the world, and they equated Zionism with racism, Zionism with international conspiracy, and the term became prejudicial. Let us first deal with Zionism. What is it? How did it start? And what does it mean today? The term Zionism was coined in the year 1890 by Nathan Birnbaum, a Jewish nationalist, and he was a co-founder of a movement named Kadima, which is the first organisation of its type, which he founded whilst at the University of Vienna. Zionism, properly, is the movement for self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. The vast majority of Jewish people around the world feel a connection, or at least a kinship, with Israel. Whether or not they explicitly identify as Zionists, and regardless of their opinion on the policies of the Israeli government, there is a heart for a national homeland in Israel and a recognition of it. There are, of course, those amongst the ultra-Orthodox that see the state of Israel as an abomination, as they sincerely believe that Israel cannot become a nation until Messiah appears. Notice they appear rather than returns when we're speaking in terms of the Jewish people. Whereas there's been a continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel over the millennia, albeit small, mostly in the north and part of Jerusalem. The yearning to return to Zion, the biblical term for both the land of Israel and Judaism, as you probably know, let us go up to Zion, so on. Zion is the catch-all name for both Jerusalem and also the land. And it's been a cornerstone of communal Jewish life for over 2,000 years. An earlier exile, the one in Babylon, prompted the psalmist to write one of the most known lamentations that we find in Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors with mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. The lament found a new expression in the hit record, By the Rivers of Babylon, by the German-based disco group Boney M in 1978. The connection between the Jews and the land and the hope for repatriation is deeply, deeply embedded in Jewish prayer, ritual, literature and culture. The longing is clearly expressed at the close of the Pesach Seder with the rousing statement, next year in Jerusalem, or a variation, this year we celebrate in X, next year in Jerusalem. The cry was both a heartfelt desire, but also a deep expression of a dream that would not become reality until 1948. The roots of Zionism lie in the Mishnah. If you're not conversant with Jewish writings, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and then, of course, we have the Talmud, the Mishnah come from the Talmud, and so on. Mishnah. All may be condemned to go up. All may be compelled. Let's use that word carefully. Compelled. All may be compelled to go up, in Hebrew, to Aliyah, to the land of Israel, but none may be compelled to leave it. This is an interesting teaching for Jewish people that are in the land, particularly in this present day. None may be compelled by the United Nations or anybody else to leave it. All may be compelled to go up to Jerusalem, but none may be compelled to leave it. That's Ketubot 13:11 in the Mishnah. In the 13th century, the noted scholar Nachmanides suggested that the return to Israel as a national homeland was, in fact, binding on every Jewish person. Nachmanides obeyed his own injunction and himself went to the land to help rebuild the small Jewish community that was there in the aftermath of the destruction of the Crusades, which we looked at in our earlier broadcast concerning anti-Semitism. Probably one of the most famous Jewish scholars, Moshe ben Maimonides, generally known as simply Maimonides, he lived between 1138 and 1204, encouraged Jewish people to return as a solution to the ill treatment of the Jewish people resident in lands controlled by the Arabs. So we can see the 13th century was a time of national impress, shall we say, and national appeal to the Jewish people to go back to the land, because both Nachmanides and Maimonides, even though one was speaking from Europe and one was speaking from the Arab lands, they could see that the only solution to the persecution was a return to their ancient and also covenanted homeland. What is known as modern Zionism emerged in the mid-19th century in tandem with the rise of the nation-state in Europe and widespread national liberation movements. It's said amongst historians that the year 1846 was a year potentially there could have been revolution all over Europe. It's thought that in England it was avoided by the Methodist revival, which is an interesting point, because the Wesleys in particular saw a future for the Jewish people. Charles Wesley himself actually writing a hymn about it. In the case of the Jews, in response to a long history of intense Jewish hatred, persecution and discrimination in the countries and societies right across the world became a living and present tension and reality. In all the nations where the Jews lived, including Europe, the Middle East, the Levant, North Africa, and anywhere Jewish people basically were to be found. In America, following the Civil War, in our last session, we looked at Ulysses S. Grant's legislation against the Jewish people. Rising Zionism's advocates sincerely believed that a modern Jewish state would provide Jews with a safe haven from the bigotry and endangerment they suffered perennially as a minority culture in non-Jewish lands and, of course, any areas that they had to live in. And Jews obviously were never the majority culture or presence in any land that they lived in. Attempts to assimilate were bound to die in failure, particularly in Germany, leading up to the Second World War, but even before the First World War. Assimilation simply did not work. anywhere the Jewish people were to be found. There were periods following the French Revolution where a certain amount of assimilation worked reasonably well, but following the Dreyfus case that we discussed in our last broadcast, Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist, a journalist working in Vienna, should I say, he was actually Hungarian, from Pest, in Budapest, observed the Dreyfus trial and considered there was now no hope at all for Jewish people within the diaspora. So rising Zionism, as we can call it, was actually best understood, and is best understood, as a cultural and national renaissance movement that sought to enable the Jewish people not only to live in peace, but to revive their own language, Hebrew, and re-establish self-determination over their traditional lives within their culture, religion, and education. All of these things were this aspiration. So in the late 1800s, the father, so-called, of modern Zionism, Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, as I say, was Hungarian, but he considered himself to be Austrian, consolidated various strands of thought into an organised political movement. The initiative undertook, firstly, advocacy for international recognition of an independent and sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel. Disagreements in philosophy led to several rifts within the nascent Zionist movement over the years, and several separate forms emerged. So for economy, I'd like to identify the different strands of Zionism. Firstly, political Zionism. Political Zionism stressed the following: political action and attainment of political rights within the land of Palestine as a prerequisite of the Zionist ideal and enterprise. Political Zionism is linked to the name of Theodor Herzl, who considered that the Jewish problem, and any of you that read history books will find this expression used frequently, the Jewish problem. Herzl considered it was a political one that would be solved by overt action within the international arena. Herzl's aim was to gain a charter to be recognised by the world leadership, granting the Jews sovereignty in a Jewish-owned territory. His major work, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, published in February 1896, proposes an outline. For any of you that are interested in it, it's freely available. You can get it from Amazon, and it really is worth a read. I can recommend it. The Basel programme was drawn up in accordance with this principle, with a basic statement that Zionism aims to establish a secure haven under public law for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. The next strand is religious Zionism. Religious Zionism is initially based on a fusion of Jewish religion and nationhood. The aim was not only to restore Jewish political freedom, but also Jewish religion, custom, and practice. Religious Zionism contains quite strong political elements in that it mostly focuses on programs geared towards constructing a national religious education system. Religious Zionism feels that Israel as a nation cannot be an authentic expression of Judaism without a religious educational strand running right through it. The next form of Zionism that most people will be probably more familiar with is, in fact, socialist Zionism. Let me say that again. socialist Zionism. Socialist Zionism has many strands over the years, but it basically operated on the idea, which is typical of most socialist systems, in movement towards the common good and common ownership. The words expressed a dream that would, in its early days, become a reality when Israel became recognised. Socialist Zionism, where common ownership and common aims and common defence were highlighted. Youth Zionist movements at the time were very keen on this, and as you're all very aware, the kibbutz system and the moshav eventually all developed from the idea of socialist Zionism. Nextly is territorial Zion, but we'll come to that after we've visited Ezra for a message. Territorial Zionism moved towards the formation of a Jewish collective in Palestine, or it could be anywhere else on the basis of self-rule. Many locations were suggested over the years. A possibility was mooted for Madagascar, another one in Australia, but these met little success because they did not meet the aims of Zionism that were centred in Zion. The Balfour Declaration of 1918 and the resulting Zionist awakening negated this particular movement and led to its dissolution in 1925. Which brings us now to our place, those of us that are involved in Aliyah. This is normally referred to as Christian Zionism, and the term became coined in the mid-20th century, superseding the previous term, Christian Restorationism. The idea of a restoration of the Jewish people in Israel was mooted in England by people like William Wilberforce, who was very keen in abolishing the slave trade, as was Lord Shaftesbury and Louis Way. They were what we might call proto-Zionists and worked effortlessly and tirelessly towards these ends. However, there were Christian groups in the 1580s following the Protestant Reformation who held some notions on these, most of the Puritan stripe, but as we said earlier, Calvin and Luther thought the whole thing was an abomination, shall we say. However, an early version of the Geneva Bible contained footnotes in reference to Romans that specifically claimed that the Jews would be converted to Christianity in the end times and thus reorientating attention to the possibility of a homeland at some time in the future. In Holland, there's a movement amongst what we might call nascent Jewish Zionists, and there's a movement when Oliver Cromwell became protector of the country for the readmission of the Jewish people to England, and an early idea caught on about a Jewish return to Israel, but it was very much in what I call the eschatological rut. So, Menashe ben Israel was the leading light in the Zionism that was nascent, began to grow, and various British Anglicans got the idea of this, and also in Scotland, in the Church of Scotland, the quite well-known and famous John Murray McShane and Andrew Bonar visited the Holy Land, as they termed it, and wrote several pamphlets and leaflets when they came back, advocating a return of the Jewish people into Israel. The Roman Catholic Church, I need to add, has always been opposed to Zionism in any way, shape or form. And when Theodore Herzl had an audience in the Vatican with Pope Pius X in 1904, which was arranged by Count Berthold Dominic Lippe, who sought out the Catholic Church's position on such matters, the Pope's response was this: "We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never, ever sanction it. The soil, interesting, isn't it? The soil of Jerusalem, if it was not always sacred, has now been sanctified, was sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As head of the church, I cannot tell you any different. The Jews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Jewish people. Vis-a-vis, if we can't recognize the Jewish people, we certainly can't recognize their land in Israel, because it's ground that Jesus spoke on." Herzl explained to the Pope that his reasoning behind the project for the creation of a Jewish state was not a religious statement per se, but that it should be better understood as representing an interest in secular land for national independence of the Jewish people. When this has been brought up in the post-war period, rather interesting, Pope Pius XII, who I'm sure you all know about during the war, and his position, made a single comment. In an exasperated tone, he says, "Does it have to be Jerusalem?" And it's interesting, the State of Israel and the Holy See only established full diplomatic relations as late as 1993, but this was as a recognition of political and civic reality rather than a theological statement. So that is Zionism. And Zionism and Zionist thought disappeared really after the death of Herzl. Herzl's family were a tragedy. His wife and his sister committed suicide, and his son died in Auschwitz, leaving a legacy, if you like, of the despair and disaster of the Jewish people. Let's look at Aliyah very quickly now. So Jews began to return to the Holy Land in the 19th century during a time of intense persecution. The political stripe of Zionism, that of Theodore Herzl and Ahad Aham, Asher Ginsburg, and the realisation that anti-Semitism was not going to away, laid a drift of people towards the Holy Land. But the first Aliyah movement, or wave of Aliyah, was a direct response to the persecutions in Tsarist Russia, along with a small amount from the Yemen. In all, this wave of 35,000 people, a massive amount of people of the day, reached the land, defining their goal as political, national and spiritual resurrection for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Aliyah met with considerable difficulties posed by climate, inhospitable terrain and crippling Turkish taxes. The Olim were helped considerably by Edmund de Rothschild by the purchase of land and setting up local moshavim round about Petah Tikva, and this is going on at the turn of the century. Following Herzl's visit to the Pope, in 1904, 40,000 people began to make their way from Russia and Poland, particularly in the wake of the Kishinev program that we looked at in our last broadcast in 1903. Members of this movement included David Ben-Gurion, who, of course, was in time to be the leader of Israel, who pronounced the Declaration of Independence in 1948. The second wave of Aliyah transformed a barren land. Mark Twain, when he visited it, described it as a desolate land only fit for jackals to live in. Out of interest, when Britain took the mandate in 1918, there were so few trees, each one was labelled. Tel Aviv was founded at this time, moves towards a restoration of the Hebrew language. The third Aliyah was inspired by more clearly defined Zionist motives between 1919, following the Balfour Declaration, and 1923, particularly with the San Remo Conference that can be considered the founding charter of the modern state. You can read about these things in Word from the Scroll of Fire, or in Father Forgive Us, or look it up on the internet. The San Remo Conference, something that should be known and considered in all discussions concerning the modern state of Israel. The fourth Aliyah is particularly interesting as it took place in the reshaping of Europe in the Middle East, numbering 80,000 people, of who 88% were from Eastern Europe and remaining 22% from the Middle East, mostly Yemen and Iraq. The fourth Aliyah then began to see middle-class families moving from Germany in the turmoil of political reconstruction. So that takes us neatly up until World War II. So we come now to post-war Aliyah and Christian Aliyah. So I'm going to finish on post-war Aliyah, and then in our next broadcast we look at Christian-sponsored Aliyah and the problems that have been faced by it, by the objections to it, and some notable events that took place. So I hope you'll join me for this on our next broadcast. But briefly, post-1948, the nation was reborn. David Ben-Gurion called upon the Jewish communities worldwide to return and rebuild the land. In 1949, the Emir of Yemen allowed 45,000 out of 46,000 from his country to leave. In addition, there were 1,500 from Aden, 500 from Djibouti and Eritrea, and 2,000 from Saudi Arabia. Operation Magic Carpet, better known as Wings of Eagles, took place between June 49 and September 1950, the people being carried by British and American transport planes that made 380 flights from Aden. Quite wonderful. So between 1949 and 1952, 130,000 people made their way to Israel from Iraq, many being encouraged by the Halot's pioneer movement, others by operations Esra and Nehemiah via Cyprus and Iran. The Ethiopian Jews began arriving in Israel later. You'll find that in our broadcast concerning the foundations of Ezra, and the rest of the Aliyah and Christian Aliyah we will do in our next broadcast. As ever, been an absolute joy to share these wonderful things about the Aliyah in its historical context. May the Lord bless you. Keep praying for the work, please, and for those that are en route to fulfill the biblical promises.